welcome to The Point. This week's show may be one of the more important shows that we do all year because it's going to contain information that voters will need to know through all of the elections, and there are a bunch of them this year. So to make sure we get the expert advice that we need before we go voting, we're going to go right to the source and two county clerks, Lisa Postmus-Lyons from Kent County and from Ottawa County, Justin Roebuck. You have been here before, and I appreciate you all coming back because it is so critical in a time when elections have gained so much scrutiny, when so many people are concerned about integrity and security of elections. And so when things change, when somebody goes to the polls and they are asked or told to do something that is either different or that they don't remember they had to do before, people can become pretty skeptical pretty quickly. So our effort today is going to be try to put people at ease because they know what the rules are. We're going to start with the first, and I think, the most confusing election of the year, which is the presidential primary. Presidential primary is set up this year differently than before because it has moved forward. And quickly, Democratic majority in the legislature and the governor wanted it moved forward. They voted to do so. In doing so, they also had to move the Republican primary. The Republican primary will not allocate all of the delegates. We can get into that a little deeper, but let's talk about the process. Justin, let's talk to you.
Yeah.
Someone wants, not a political reporter, but someone wants to vote in the presidential primary.
Yeah.
What do they have to do? And I should point out at this point, ballots have already gone out for absentee.
Yeah,
right?
correct. Yeah, and as you stated, Rick, this is a different process. It's a different election than really any other election we'll experience in this cycle. And that is because the legislature has specifically set up this presidential primary, as they have in the past several cycles, to require, essentially, it's what we call a closed primary, and they require the voter to select which political party they would like to participate in. So Michigan is not a party registration state. We do not, as election officials, identify any voter in the voter registration system as an R or a D or an I or anything else. But for this election, if voters would like to choose a presidential primary candidate, they do need to tell their local election officials essentially which ballot they want.
And Lisa, that is not something that's going to stick around in your record. So when it comes to the next election, big election will be in August, it has no bearing, right?
Yeah, I think that's really important to really emphasize that though you're required to select your party preference for this presidential primary, it does not mean you are declaring or registering an affiliation with that party. And so that's really important because I think Michigan voters really kind of like our independent streak, the fact that they don't have to be a member of a certain party to make their voices heard. So that's really important. But as these ballots have gone out, we're now within the last 6 weeks of the election. Absentee ballots have gone out. It's really important that you do make that selection because if you don't, the law requires your local clerk to contact you. So you may get a phone call, a text, an email, or a letter from your clerk. It is not spam. It's legitimate official election communication so that you can actually receive your ballot. They'll be contacting you to make sure that you indicate what party preference you want so that they can send the ballot. They cannot send you a ballot prior to. And if you don't want to vote in the presidential primary, if you don't have a preferred candidate, you can also ask for a local proposal ballot. So and not every jurisdiction will have a proposal on their ballot, but if you do, it doesn't mean you have to participate in either of the presidential primaries to cast your ballot for that proposal.
And fast forwarding to 4 years from now, voter A selects party B in this election. 4 years from now, they can select any party they want to. Has no bearing except for this election.
Yeah, literally the only reason there is a party selection is the simple fact that we need to know which ballot to hand the voter. And while that data is kept, and it is subject to the Freedom of Information Act, so that is a part of the public process of the voting process. So political parties, for example, or interest groups, may FOIA this information from the Secretary of State's office, for example, and essentially use that as a way build a mailing list, for example.
And remember, when they get this information, it doesn't include who you voted for.
Absolutely.
It includes that you voted in that particular
ballot you
party's
picked.
primary.
Right.
Right. And it's very different than, say, the August primary, where you'll receive one ballot, and in one lane there's the Republican candidates for the primary, in the other lane there's the Democratic candidates, and that's why in those elections we say stay in your lane. This is just a different kind of election as required by statute.
And we're going to go into that a little bit later because I want to talk about that primary election coming up because that's confusing for folks too. We have the presidential primary, but we still have our August primary. One more thing about the presidential before we move along. There are people that are on lists to automatically get that ballot, that absentee ballot that comes around. This time, however, and that ship has already sailed, they would have already received that. But this time around, not the same because they have to make that selection. So they would get a new ballot
Selection form. Yeah,
So-
presidential primary selection form, essentially.
And that's what we're talking about when or if you receive a call from your clerk. It's because those people getting an automatic ballot didn't have to submit an application stating which ballot they wanted sent to them. So it's kind of a proactive communication to get that ballot selection in.
All right. Over the past decade, we have seen a number of election law changes. So let's start with the very basics. Before you can vote, you have to register. Where, when, and how can you do that?
And it's the first thing that you want to make sure is in place if you want to cast a ballot in any election. Am I registered to vote? You can find that out online. I know Justin's got a website. Our website's kentcountyvotes.com. It will take you to a place where you can find out if you're registered to vote. You can register to vote in Michigan as a result of some of these changes the last several years, up to and including Election Day. Where you register to vote is, is dependent upon when you register to vote. So if you're 14 days or sooner, within 14 days of the election, you have to go to your local clerk's office to register to vote if you want to vote in that particular election. Otherwise, you can vote, at the county clerk's office or register to vote at the county clerk's office, the local clerk's office, some state agencies as well. And you can register to vote online.
And anybody who's going to get a driver's license is going to be asked if they want to register to vote.
Well, correct, with automatic
They're
voter
automatically-
registration.
Automatically
They're not even
registered
asked.
unless they opt out.
Interesting. So you may be registered and you don't even know it. So that's one thing. And
Right.
another thing is that if you register day of, you can't just go in and say, my name's, Joe Voter, I want to vote.
Right.
You have to provide something, right?
Yes, and that's an important reminder for voters as well. So if you want to register to vote or change your voter registration, update your address to the new location that you live at, you are required, again, to go in person to your local clerk's office, the city or township where you vote, to register for Election Day registration. And so you'll be asked to provide some documentation, your photo ID, and also, proof of residency, essentially. And that system works to register voters in a live database, and so, it's preventing someone from potentially committing fraud by registering, in more than one place on Election Day and casting a ballot. But that's why it's important to do so at the local clerk's office.
When I show up to vote and they say your name's not on our list, and I say, but I know I'm registered, and they say, but we don't have your name. What happens to me then?
Yeah, so a couple different things. So the electronic poll book, which is in every single precinct in the state of Michigan, it has data built into that system that is not live data. So in your precinct on Election Day, the electronic poll book that is there would have the information for every voter in the jurisdiction. So for example, if you've moved within recent weeks or months and may have not had that registration updated to the precinct where you're at, your election worker could probably be able to tell you if you're registered in another precinct. However, if you're registered outside of the jurisdiction, you'll need to contact your local clerk, or you can visit michigan.gov/vote. That's a great quick check for voters to confirm their voter registration and to confirm the address and the polling location that they need to vote at.
I think that's a good point to make too. When if you are registered to vote in that jurisdiction, but you're in the wrong precinct, the election worker will direct you to what precinct you're supposed to be voting at.
Yeah.
If you know that you are registered to vote in that precinct, there's voter registration cards that get mailed to every voter, and you happen to have that. If you show them that will address the issue. If you have registered to vote at the clerk's office on election day, they will send you to your precinct, or you can vote absentee. If you go to your precinct, you have to show them a receipt that you will be given by the clerk as proof that you're registered to vote, because, as Justin said, that electronic poll book is not live. It's not live, it's not connected to the internet, and so it doesn't know that you had already registered.
Yeah, and so the bottom line, and I think the point I was trying to get to here, is that you have a lot of ways that you can register beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely.
And unless you absolutely have to, there's no point in causing yourself and those poll workers the extra headache, because you can register right now. And if you register right now, you're good to go for the presidential primary, and the general election.
We definitely encourage people to register to vote prior to election day. It's just it'll go a lot smoother for everybody, and so we want to make sure that people get out and get registered.
Our message, and I know Lisa and I were on the same page with this over the past few cycles, plan your vote. It's so important to be able to, first do that registration check. If you're not registered or need to update your address, there's a lot of ways to do that. But then you can also view that sample ballot well ahead of the election as well. There's a lot of stuff on our ballots, and it's nice to be able to look at a sample ballot, do some research beforehand. If you plan to vote in person, you can obviously get an absentee ballot and do that at your kitchen table as well. But it's always a great, good advice to plan your vote.
Yeah, and I would just echo one thing before we take a break, that when you look at that ballot in advance, there are going to be things on there that you don't know about, I promise, in almost every case. Even in the presidential primary, as you point out, there are some issues on there too. If you look at those beforehand, you have a chance to research and know how you're going to vote. That makes your time in the booth shorter and the line behind you shorter. All of those things will help. We've got a lot more election stuff to talk about. We'll do it when we come back to the point. Welcome back to the Point. We're talking about all things voting. We're not talking about who you're voting for. We're talking about how you vote with two county clerks, Justin Roebuck from Ottawa County and Lisa Posthumus-Lyons from Kent County. Okay, we know we've gotten through the presidential primary in our first part of our discussion, and we've talked about registration. Now let's get to something new, early voting. According to a ballot initiative that was passed, everybody in the state has the ability to vote for 10 days, 9 days in advance and day of the election. That's
at least.
At least. And we can get into that too, but that gets even more confusing. Right. But you're going to have at least those days. So 9 days before the election, you can go somewhere to vote. Tell me how that works and what it has meant for both of your offices. Go ahead.
Sure. This is new as a result of Proposal 2 of 2022. Each jurisdiction will implement early voting, and it is at least 9 days, and I think up to 29 days.
Maximum of 29.
The maximum of 29 days, which you're going to find. I don't know how many jurisdictions will actually go that long. In Kent County, 9 days is the length for early voting for all of our voters. It'll be different in different counties, and so I think Justin can touch on a little bit what they're doing. In Kent County, you can go and cast your ballot in person, feed it through the tabulator, 9 days early. We're doing things in Kent County where each voter will go to their jurisdiction's early voting site. So each jurisdiction in Kent County is going to operate and run their own early voting site. We felt with this change, it is huge. We were concerned that voters may be a little confused as to where they would go. And we really want to get a baseline of what to expect for early voting. Who's going to be coming out? How many? Are they going to be the traditional in-precinct election day voters? Are they going to be absentee voters? Or is it going to draw out new voters? So we just really want to get a baseline, this kind of first cycle implementing early voting. And with that, we just think at the local level, that's what the voters know. And so at this point, that's where they should go.
So just to clarify, in Kent County, and this will not be the case everywhere because you can combine jurisdictions if you need to. But in Kent County, when I go to vote on the first vote that I'll cast will likely be in August, but I can go 9 days early to the polling place I would normally go.
And it won't be your normal precinct location. The early voting sites will very likely be different for most people than their election day sites. So those early voting sites can be found on the website, on the state website, on KentCountyVotes.com, and that's where the people will go. Generally speaking, there will be one. In Kent County, there will be one early voting site in each jurisdiction. The larger jurisdictions, particularly Grand Rapids, will have multiple, I think 2 or 3.
So, for example, if you live in a township, there would be one within that township.
Correct.
And it won't necessarily be where you're going to vote
On election day.
on election day. So that's going to be confusing. Your phones are going to be ringing off
Right.
the hook.
That's why we call it an early voting site and not an early voting precinct or not your precinct. We want to be really intentional with our verbiage.
And what about Ottawa County?
So as Lisa said, this is a very unique process where really jurisdictions and counties across Michigan have multiple ways that they can organize and do early voting. And in Ottawa, we've taken a different approach where essentially the county is collaborating with our 23 local jurisdiction clerks to offer early voting at 4 vote center sites. So if you look at early voting across the United States, what you typically find is this vote center model where in a large degree, it's run at the county level. And so a vote center is a place where anyone in the jurisdiction, anyone in the county can come and cast a ballot. So, and the difference between a precinct on election day is that, your precinct is in your neighborhood, right? That's generally speaking somewhere close to home, somewhere where you're, used to going to vote election day, and that's not going to change. But a vote center is largely a more convenient location. So if you're on your way to work, it's a large facility. It's a larger facility that has convenient access to transportation or highways close to where people are traveling. And so what we've taken an approach of doing 4 regional sites. One is going to be in the Coopersville area, one in Grand Haven, one in the Georgetown Township area, Hudsonville area, one in Holland. And so these 4 sites, any resident, any registered voter within Ottawa County can cast their ballot at any of these 4 sites in the 9 days leading up to every state and federal election in this cycle. And so miottawa.org/early voting is where you can get all that information. So there's going to be uniform times and hours of operation. And so voters hopefully will help solve a little bit of that communication gap, right, with all of these changes so that voters at least know specifically where they need to go and what they need to do.
And as with registration, a little pre-planning will help voters a lot to know where they're supposed to go, and they can go to your website. So much to cover, so I need to stipulate this. You're going to be collecting votes early. 40 days early, you're going to be having absentee ballots are going to start coming back in. 9 days of early voting. On election day, when do you start counting votes?
Good question. So we'll be starting to count, the in-precinct election day votes. Those begin to get tabulated as soon as the polls open. They don't get reported until after the polls close and they're closed down, and then we print off tapes, and then those get actually reported. When it comes to absentee voting, in the past, Michigan did not tabulate absentee ballots until election day. Part of these sweeping changes that have come into effect allows for essentially early processing of absentee ballots. So jurisdictions could start counting or tabulating the absentee ballots up to 8 days prior to.
And I think it is important to note, as Lisa was saying, no totals are generated before the polls close on election night. So we have all these new processes now where early voting, you can walk in and tabulate your ballot. You can put that ballot into a voting machine, and it's counting your ballot during early voting, but no totals are going to be generated. Absentee ballots are being counted earlier by some of our larger jurisdictions in particular, but the totals are not being generated until election night. And this is the process really across multiple states in the United States. When you look at states like Florida, which reported their presidential election results in the last cycle before midnight statewide, these are common practices that states are using to ensure that, particularly when we have this shift in the way voters are voting, right? When we have a lot more absentee ballots being cast, we're able to get those in a timely manner and report results quickly.
And just so people understand, when you talk about tabulating, this is all information that's being gathered, and you're not going to see it at the bottom of your television screen until after those polls close, and hopefully sometime before you go to bed.
It is so important that people understand and know that votes aren't, I guess they're not totaled and reported and made public until after the polls close, and those reports are generated and then reported to the counties to be able to report to the public.
All right, so we've talked about early voting. We've talked about absentee voting to the degree that I think people are familiar with that. We've also now talked a little bit about how all of this is going to work as it pertains to the presidential primary. And of course, all these systems will be in place as we move on. But let's talk about the August primary for a minute. And Lisa, I'm going to go to you because you spoke about this earlier. Every election cycle, people are confused. And I'll get the phone call and it'll go like this. I wanted to vote for John Democrat for my state senator, and in the state senate primary, and my good friend, councilman, that would be a nonpartisan, but state representative as a Democrat, and they wouldn't let me do it, and you won't let them do it. And how does that work? How does the primary ballot work for? This is again confusing. This is for the state primary in August, not the presidential primary. The state primary this August.
So we have 4 elections this year. We have the February 27th presidential primary. We'll have the May special election for any proposals that go on the ballot. Then we'll have the statewide August 6th primary, and then the statewide general election November 5th. The August 6th primary, you will get a ballot for all the races, with the exception of president, United States Senate, all the way on down to precinct delegate. And that ballot will have on one side, you'll have a list of Republican candidates. On the other side, you'll have a list of the Democratic candidates. Stay in your lane. If you cross over, if you like a candidate for, a Republican candidate for this particular office, but like a Democratic candidate for a different office, you got to pick your favorite and then go with that party all the way down the ballot. If you cross over in a primary election, you will spoil your ballot and your vote won't count. You can cross over in a general election, certainly, but not in the primary.
Yeah, and that's a very good distinction to make because, again, you are not selecting an affiliation, but you don't have the opportunity to vote in both primaries, right?
Correct, right. So these are political party elections, essentially. You think of them as nominations for the general election. In the general election, you can vote however you want. You can vote one candidate, Green Party, the next office, Libertarian, the next Republican, the next Democratic, in a general election in November. But the political parties, the major political parties in Michigan hold their primary on that August ballot, and you can only participate in one or the other. Again, because we don't have party registration in Michigan, you're not required to go and register as a political party in order to cast a ballot, but you do have to stick in that.
Clerks, thank you both for being here. Good luck during this election cycle, and thanks for being on this week's To The Point.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it, Rick.
This week's episode of To The Point will be available at woodtv.com throughout the election season. So if you have any questions or need clarification, it will be available for you there. And of course, we'll continue to bring you election information here on To The Point and on News 8 during the week. This week, Governor Gretchen Whitmer will give her State of the State address. That's where she will outline her priorities for the coming year and talk to legislators and the people of Michigan about what she sees in the months ahead. Different from last year's speech when she laid out a litany of Democratic priorities that were quickly acted upon by the Democratic majority in both chambers, the governor will be talking to a temporarily tied House at 54-54, and Democrats have no ability to pass anything without at least one Republican vote. That may slow the pace of legislation until 2 vacancies are filled in the spring. Next week, we'll have a recap of that speech and more when you join us To The Point.